Next up, we have Simon Roschmann. Simon is a second-year PhD student supervised by Zeynep Akata at Helmholtz Munich and at the Technical University of Munich. His research focuses on multimodal machine learning across the vision, language, and time series domain. And today, Simon will show us how vision models trained on natural images can be effectively repurposed for time series classification. We're looking forward to learning how this works. Thanks.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the introduction. Today, I'm excited to present how pre-trained vision transformers can actually be reused for time series classification. And this was a joint work of our group at Helmholtz Munich and TUM with collaborators from NOAA's ARC Lab in Paris. Time series can be found almost everywhere. We can attach sensors to different parts of our human body. We can, for example, measure the electrical activity of the human brain, and we then get EEG recordings, or we can measure the electrical activity of the human heart and get EEG recordings. In the end, what we want to do with all of these time series is actually classify them. Because we want to know if a human heart beats normal or abnormal, or we want to know if a certain time series indicates a disease. And in the optimal case, we want to have one model that is able to perform all of these classification tasks. And that's exactly what foundation models have been developed for in recent years. Foundation models are large models trained on a large amount of data. They are supposed to learn general representations, which can then be easily adapted for a wide range of tasks. Let's have a look how the state-of-the-art in time series foundation models looks like. There are two prominent examples here. The first one is Mantis. It is pre-trained contrastively. So that actually means that the model learns to output similar representations for similar time series and dissimilar representations for very different time series. And another approach of pre-training is mask modeling, where parts of the time series are masked out, and the model is then trained to predict this masked part given the unmasked part. So it's a pre-training task where the model has to acquire some general knowledge about time series. And in this domain, these foundation models are trained on millions of time series, ranging from like 2 million to 10 million. And what may actually sound like a lot is not a lot, especially if we compare it to foundation models in other domains, like the vision domain or the language domain. So in the vision domain, foundation models are often pre-trained on billions of images. We have models like CLIP, SIGLIP, or DynoV3. They also apply contrastive learning or mask modeling in some way, or combinations of these. And they learn very strong feature extraction capabilities. And what we ask ourselves in this work is exactly, can we reuse their strong feature extraction capabilities, but in a different domain on these time series for classification? The method we propose here is TiViT, the time vision transformer. We start with a one-dimensional time series, and we then have to transform it into images such that the vision transformers are actually able to process them. So we take the first few signals, put them into the first row of a matrix, the next few signals into the second row, and so on. So we get a 2D representation. We can then replicate channels such that we get an RGB image, and this image is then segmented into patches. These patches are each represented by an embedding, and we then have a series of tokens that the vision transformer can actually operate on across different layers. And you will later see that the choice of layers is actually quite important in order to have competitive classification performance. In the end, we want to have a single representation for a given time series, and this one can then be used in any classification head, for example, with a logistic regression classifier. Here for comparison, I also have how conventional time series foundation models actually operate. The main difference here is that they perform the patching in 1D rather than in 2D, as we saw with the images. And you will later see that these models are actually not exclusive, but can even be combined. Here are a few more details on how we can transform time series into images. You see one example of an ECG signal and how different patch sizes actually affect the image we get. So the patch size here determines how many signals do we put into one row of the matrix before we then rescale that 2D representation to the ViT input resolution. And we experiment here with different patch sizes and also with different overlaps so that we have a sliding window approach of extracting our signals. We determine the optimal patch size on a validation set per dataset across 128 different time series datasets, but we also propose to just use the square root of the time series length as a simple rule for patching. And we can see that once we introduce overlap, the differences between taking the optimal patch size P star or our heuristic rule actually vanish. And especially when we introduce overlap, the accuracies become very close to each other. So that means that there is no need to really search for an optimal patch size per dataset. And this makes this entire transformation of time series into images rather efficient. Now, what is the performance that we can achieve with TiViT? Here, we evaluated on the UCR collection. It's 128 univariate datasets, and also on UEA and Woods, which altogether comprises around 30 multivariate datasets. You can see that our method TiViT performs or outperforms most of these time series foundation models, Moment and Mantis, in these settings. And especially when we combine their representations, they achieve top performance across all of these datasets. And combining here means that we simply just concatenate representations of TiViT and time series foundation models before we actually forward them into a classification head. We have a few more comparisons with other foundation models, with self-supervised methods that are pre-trained per dataset, and also with fully supervised approaches trained per dataset. And the main takeaway here is that TiViT, which has only been pre-trained on natural images, actually outperforms most of the time series foundation models that have been trained, pre-trained, or trained on time series. I mentioned before that the choice of layers is actually important in order to get competitive performance. And what we do here in this experiment is that we take representations after every layer of the vision transformer. So we have a sequence of tokens that get processed layer by layer, and at every layer we then aggregate these representations into a single representation by just averaging them. And here we can see across the depth of the vision transformer from the input projection up to the final layer, we actually have the best representation somewhere in the middle of the ViT. So somewhere between 40% and 70% of the layer depth, we achieve the highest accuracy. And you can also see that if we just use simply the final representations, that would not really be competitive to the time series foundation baselines. And we find in our work that this actually correlates with the intrinsic dimension of representations. So what we use here is the 2NN estimator, and we basically have a look at how many variables are really necessary to describe representations across layers. And we can then see that there's a strong correlation between the performance of layers in downstream classification and the intrinsic dimension of representations in these layers. As I mentioned before, these two model families, they do not just exist exclusively. We can actually combine them, and we find that their representations are quite complementary. So here we try different fusion approaches. We take different time series foundation models, like the ones I had introduced, Mantis and Moment. We also take TiViT with different ViT backbones from CLIP or Dino v3. And we then, in the end, also combine TiViT with time series foundation models. And you can see in the very last row here that combining TiViT with a CLIP backbone and the strongest time series foundation model, Mantis, actually achieves the top joint accuracy across these 128 UCR datasets. So far, we have only looked at the models purely frozen. So we took features of pre-trained models, but we didn't really train them. And we can assume that there still remains some kind of gap between models that are only pre-trained on natural images and the time series domain. And that's why we also look if continual pre-training on time series can actually further boost the performance of models. But here we restrict ourselves to rather small ViTs. So the models we use here are just having around 36 million parameters, compared to the big vision transformers, where I showed the results before with more than 200 million parameters. And the paradigm we use here for continual pre-training is, again, contrastive pre-training. So we have a time series, we apply augmentations to get different versions of it, and we then enforce that representations should be close to each other for the same time series. And what you can see here is that compared to the frozen backbone, this can further boost the performance. So across 128 datasets that are further boost of 1%, and it actually closes the gap to the large and frozen ViTs that I had shown before. So we can see here that even small models with just 36 million parameters can actually be very competitive in this time series classification task when they get continually pre-trained. We also have some qualitative results to share. So we look into what kind of representations does TiViT actually extract. And here we take synthetic time series data. We vary the trend, the amplitude, or the frequency of these time series. So what it means here is that basically similar colors represent similar characteristics of time series. And when we then get the TiViT representation and actually project them into 2D, we can see that similar representations are often grouped together for like similar time series characteristics. We also apply attention rollout, where we want to see where does the model actually look at when it makes classification decisions. High attention scores are here visualized in red, and we can see that the model mainly pays attention to very dark or bright areas in the images, which then correspond to low or high signals in the time series, so to the most salient parts of a time series. And finally, we also look into t-SNE visualizations on data sets. We, again, have 2D projections of our TiViT representations, and we can find that they are actually very well aligned with ground truth labels. So here, the different labels are represented with different colors, and you can see that TiViT is able to actually group representations very well according to their underlying classes without ever seeing any class labels. Finally, we also looked into the benefits of TiViT across different dataset characteristics. And the most interesting results here are actually in the first 4 columns. We have data sets here that are very small with just up to 20 samples for training of the classification head. And we also have data sets with very long time series. And especially in these 2 settings, TiViT outperforms the time series foundation models, Moment and Mantis. It generalizes quite well from few training samples, mostly because it has learned very good discriminative patterns during pre-training on the natural images, and it is also able to effectively model the long-range dependencies. So we can assume that 2D is actually a better setup for modeling long-range dependencies than just having a very long one-dimensional sequence. So to conclude, we basically found that the hidden representations of ViTs are very effective for time series classification. TiViT surpasses time series foundation models on a variety of benchmarks. The representations of these model families are actually complementary, and together they can achieve the current state-of-the-art on univariate and multivariate benchmarks. And continual pre-training can further boost the performance, especially for smaller ViTs. So if you are working in the time series domain, I would be happy if you give our model a try. Our preprint is available on arXiv, and our code is also open source on GitHub. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot. Any questions? Yes, over there.
Simon, interesting stuff. I really particularly like those, time series foundation model. Like for me, it was Chronos, but I think there's some other from Amazon and so on. You seem to be competitive in parts. Can you briefly explain the logic behind this sort of obviously permutation invariant type of representation of the series that you choose? I mean, right? You sort of just randomly arrange them on the y-axis to sort of build your dynamics. And like if I now took some other type of time series, like is there maybe some? It just sounds so random that spatial information would help here. I can imagine that your vision transformer sort of long range and so on. This part sort of on the time axis can get, but why does the other axis really help when the sensors could be so different things?
So there are some experiments where we looked into finding the best patch size, because we thought, for example, that it could be very helpful to have the different legs of time series, so that we can, for example, say, okay, every row represents one episode of the time series, and then it gets grouped according to this, but this actually doesn't have much of an effect. And also the visualization itself didn't matter too much. We, for example, also had some experiments where we just used line plots, and it also worked reasonably well. So I think the main part is not so much the visualization, it's actually just that these vision transformers have learned very strong discriminative features, and no matter what you then input into them, they are very well able to group similar patterns close to each other.
So your vision would be to actually extend those existing time series foundation model with this complementary representation, or to train your own big one?
So I think there are two ways. I think they can be complementary in some way, which we saw. So it does not necessarily mean that they are exclusive, and actually if we have an ensemble of them, this can give us the strongest performance. So I think there should be also effort into actually modeling time series in 1D as well. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, let's thank Simon again. Sorry, and again,